All right, thank you for tuning in to the second part of our Dyatlov Pass episode of Disquiet Time. We have Anne and Natasha here still, and we're going to continue our discussion of what happened out there in 1959. And at this point, they're looking around. They're like, nobody's in this tent. And then they notice footprints. And they can count 9 sets of them, but it looks like nobody is properly in their shoes. That they're either stocking feet or bare feet even in the snow, and they're walking single file down the hill towards the tree line as if they're going for shelter. But it's walking. It looks like it's walking speed, not running, not stumbling. Nobody's being dragged or helped along. Everybody's walking under their own steam, which is interesting.
Just a short note, the Russian sources are saying 8 pairs of steps, not 9. 8.
Oh, I did not get that at all. Ooh.
Hey, so there's...
Wait, that makes sense with Semyon. Okay, that might make sense later. Go on, Anne.
No, I'm just saying that is interesting because, most things do report that it was clear that they were together and everything was fine, which makes later make less sense.
So that actually kind of helps me with some of it. Okay. Because I was really confused about something Semyon was doing. Okay, so some number of footsteps, and they think it's most of them, and it looks like nobody's being dragged or anything, right?
Yeah,
are
exactly.
Going down the hill, and at a walking pace, not a running, not a panicked scramble, everybody going their own direction. Okay.
That's correct. Yeah.
Okay, good. So they're all heading down, and as they head down and they follow these footsteps, and they're still visible after 3 weeks, which is kind of freaky, but all right. I don't know how snow works up there, so I'm just accepting that. And they get to a clearing, or they get to the tree line, and the first thing they find is that there's this large, it's alternately reported as different types of trees, but most of them said cedar tree. There's a large cedar tree there, and they can see that a bunch about, up to like 5 meters up, so about 15 feet up, a bunch of the branches are broken off. And as they start looking around, they find the remnants of a small fire, and they end up finding the first 2 bodies. First is this Georgie, and then our first Yuri D. They find them. And what's interesting is the bodies have obviously been moved post-mortem. They're not just laying how they died, and they're barely dressed. They have on just like underclothes and stockings and t-shirts, basically. They're barely dressed. Obviously died of hypothermia. So at first they're thinking they ran out of the tent dressed like this. But later...
It makes far much more sense that that's not what happened.
Yeah, later they start finding pieces of their clothing on other people. So obviously they died first. Other people start taking their clothes to keep themselves alive.
Even if they were working in the middle of the night, they were not dressed in just underwear and socks.
Right.
We've been camping in March here, and you did not get undressed.
No.
Well, yeah, and these 2, I think, also have some burns on their feet and their hands.
That's what I was going to then say next, is that this is where burns come in. They had burns on their hands. Some of their skin was burned. We don't know if that's from the small fire or if it happened like in the tent. Further up, they do have some burns on them, and one of them, and I'm not sure which one of them, has a few broken bones consistent with like maybe a fall from the tree, like maybe they had climbed to the tree and fallen. So, but the question is, why were they climbing the tree? What were they looking for?
Right.
I mean, it's incredibly high wind, it's snowing, it's way below zero in no matter which way you're rating temperature. And why are they climbing the tree? Are they looking for something? Are they trying to find their camp again? Don't know, but somebody climbed the tree, and at least one of them fell. I suspect 2 of them fell, but one of the bodies there does have some broken bones consistent with a fall, and they both have some burns on them, which is interesting. Let's see, let me scroll my notes up a little bit.
And as you're looking at your notes, just to put this a little into perspective, when you're talking about bad weather conditions, I looked it up, so it's minus 40 degrees Celsius. That's about minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit.
It's insane.
And the wind is roughly 30 kilometers per hour, which is like 20 miles per hour? Does that sound about right?
About right, yeah. It's incredibly high winds. and that's one of the things when we start talking about theories is these are experienced hikers. Why on earth would they get out of that tent in weather like this? Because that is insanity weather. That's not, I'm going to step out and take a few pictures of the stars.
Right. 18.6 miles per hour. So that's
close to 20. Yep. That's fast. That's hard. It's crazy. And the wind speed kind of feeds into some of this a little bit too. So they found those two guys, and then they start heading back up towards the tent, and eventually after, I think it takes a few days, they find the next three scattered out. They're like spaced out, heading back. Their bodies look like they're faced like they're heading back to the tents. And the first one they find of those three is Dyatlov himself, and he's died of hypothermia, but they see that there's scratches and stuff like around his ankles, and he's got some bruising on his face and looks like he's had a tooth knocked out. So he's been in a fist fight or something.
Right.
Right before he died. Pretty peculiar.
And the tree is like some people try to say that they were attacked by a bear or something.
Some of the people think they were attacked by the Mansi, but that makes no sense. I'll go over that.
That also makes no sense, yeah.
But he had some scratches, he had some bruises, he was missing a tooth, but ultimately he froze. And then further on, they find Zenaida, and she had some bruising on her that was like a stick or a baton or something. She'd been hit with something long and hard, but she again froze to death. The last one they found was Rustam, and he was the furthest on. He was the closest to the tent, and he froze to death, but he had a small skull fracture. Enough that he probably was disoriented, not in his right mind. It was a bad enough injury for that, but it wouldn't have caused his death. He was also considered to have frozen to death. And this is why I think two people fell out of the tree. I think possibly whoever the other one was, and Rustam fell out of the tree and he hit his head.
Something like that.
So, because he had no other physical injuries. He didn't get rolled down the mountain by an avalanche or something. So,
I saw in some of the Russian sources is that Dyatlov is the closest to the tree.
Yes.
It's kind of like interesting if you, the tent is up the mountain, the tree is down the hill, and if you kind of draw a straight line from the tent to the tree, that's pretty much where you find these three.
Yes, in a line. Yes.
Yeah. And Dyatlov is the closest to the tree, and then Slobodin Rustem is second, and Zinaida Kolmogorova is third, to where Russian sources are saying she made it furthest. Which
I heard the opposite, that Rustem was the furthest and she was in the middle. Oh, interesting. That changes things.
Maybe, I don't know if it's referring to like the order in which they were found in terms of like who was found first, who was found second, who was found third, but in terms of distance, who traveled the furthest.
She made it the furthest.
That's what I saw when I was looking at Russian sources, which kind of is consistent with the fact that women are more resilient to adversity and may actually
quickly.
May actually make it slightly further. And also Slobodin does have the trauma to the head, which may affect his orientation, like you said, and his physical ability to climb up the hill.
Yes. So that kind of blows one of my theories out of the water then, because I thought maybe he was acting crazy and thought he was heading back to the tent and they followed him to bring him back and ended up freezing. But that wouldn't make sense then in that order. So that's interesting. Okay, see, this just makes it even weirder. Okay. Now, what happened is these bodies also looked like they had been, or at least Dyatlov, I'm not sure about the other two, looked like they had been moved post-mortem again and some clothing removed from them. So it sounds like the survivors were at least aware where they were and again, took some clothing if they could. And they headed then further down the hill. And I saw different reports, like that the fire was set up and that they were building, like they were digging biovacs, like snow homes, like a couple of them, trying to get people into shelter and stuff. But I don't know where that theory really comes from. No one ever said we actually found a dugout spot. But the last four weren't found for months.
Let me comment on that.
Yes.
They actually found something that looks like a raft.
A
Kind of
raft?
like, a raft, as in like there were branches of trees, branches from the sea that were positioned, that were crisscrossed to form a raft-like structure. And clothing of different members of the group was found on the raft, and that was kind of further. It was further from the tent and further from the tree towards the river.
Whoa!
And from what I gathered, it took a lot of effort to set this up, and that's where the tree branches mostly went, because not just the cedar tree did not have any limbs for up to like 15 feet from the ground, but some of the trees in the vicinity, some smaller trees and larger trees as well, were missing a lot of branches. And that's where
didn't come up at all. Wow.
And that's where those branches went. Yeah, they built kind of like, I don't know if you call it like a deck, but you know what I'm talking about, right? Like,
so was it like something they were going to sit on or use as a windbreak, or?
Or maybe like, just as a way to spend the night, and then maybe.
Okay, so like a lean-to, it would block the wind and they would be behind it.
No, I think this is horizontal. The snow forms the vertical, and this wood stuff is horizontal. So
so they would be on it.
Yeah, for them to lie on it. Exactly.
Oh, interesting. Okay, that's, again, wow, that really messes with some of my theories. Okay.
I'm sorry.
No, this is great. I love it.
Okay.
And so I'm just going to guess that it was probably these last 4 that must have built that and were working on that, because the last 4 weren't found for another 3 months. And something had happened that they had been, basically they must have been tumbled somehow and fallen over a ravine into what was then a frozen river, but by the time they were found was a liquid river. And they had severe injuries, much more extensive injuries. And like, not just the predation and the decomposition injuries of missing eyes, missing tongues, but I think it was Ludmila had such extensive injuries to her chest that she had been bleeding into her right atrium. So that's what killed her. Major head traumas, lots of bruising, and these guys were really seriously beat up. So something terrible happened to them. And then they were wearing a lot of the missing clothing from the other guys. So they had survived the longest. That part seems pretty obvious. And they had continued to go downhill, didn't know about this raft. I guess they'd built this shelter. Something happened to push them over the ravine, and they got seriously injured. Because there's no way that if something happened at the tent, that Ludmila, bleeding into her atrium, made it that far on her own.
Right.
She was too severe. So the injury happened closer to where she was found. But some of the clothing was burned, and a lot of it was torn and very, very damaged, which is interesting. But I want to say something about the burned clothing, that there was a photograph from just a couple of days before this incident, and one of the guys, you can see very clearly that the sleeve of his jacket is burned, has quite a big burn on it. So I'm going to guess this camp stove was not the safest thing in the world, that they had burn injuries going on before whatever this incident was.
Right. Something has been happening with that stove, if that's...
Yeah.
If there's multiple already.
Right. So some of the clothing, some of the people are burned when they're found, but there's photographic evidence that there were at least some burns beforehand. So, I don't know where to take that information. So, but these guys were, of course, after 3 months out in the elements, were in the worst shape. Predators had obviously been at them. They had been in running water. One of them was this Semyon, and he had his camera with him, which I think is very interesting. But his camera, one of the cameras was left in the tent, and they just saw all the normal photographs on that one. But his camera, they weren't able to recover a whole lot after those exposures. But one of the last photographs appears highly damaged, hard to say, to be a picture of possibly the night sky, a dark sky, and a very bright light. Don't know for sure.
Right.
Very, very damaged. But my question is, why did he have his camera? If you're getting up and you're scooting out of the tent in this kind of weather without your shoes, why would you grab your camera? So,
I guess it depend on what you think you're getting out there for, but
right.
yeah.
What would make him grab his camera? But now, this is interesting. Now, with Natasha saying there were only 8 sets of prints, and some people are saying it looks like Semyon and maybe, I think, Nikolai were already out of the tent. He may have already been further away. He may have been, whatever he was doing outside the tent in that gosh awful weather, he was not a part of whatever happened, it sounds like. So, I don't know. It just makes it interesting now that there were 8 going down the hill instead of 9. Mm-hmm. He may have already been somewhere else.
Well, and also these 4 who were found last in the creek were the best dressed, not like in terms of like
yes.
best as in cool, but best in terms of like they had the warm clothing, they had some kind of
from the other people. Yep.
Yeah, some boots on and whatnot. Mm-hmm. So, the ones who were by the fireplace barely had anything on them because their clothes were cut off. We know that. Yes. But the 3 who went up the hill to try and get to the tent, they were not clothed very well. Like some were wearing socks, right? And they didn't have any gloves. So, yeah, it's kind of interesting that the people who were trying to make it to the tent were not outfitted to venture out there into the elements, and the people who were kind of towards the deck where they were in a way more safe, they were safer from the wind, they were actually clothed better.
Yes, so like they'd either scavenged from all the dead people, or that's why they lived the longest, because they were already dressed better, something. But like I think they said that was it Ludmila was wearing somebody's pants, like they identified them as somebody else's. Let me find that note. She had on Georgie's burned and torn pants. So, they did scavenge, obviously, but maybe they were the best dressed to begin with, and that's how they got as far as they got. Let's see, but like Nikolai had major skull damage. That's probably what killed him. And we already said Ludmila had the chest damage that was caused by like extreme pressure, not like a strike from a person. It was they compared it to like car crash, that kind of extreme force. Semyon had chest damage as well. He had what they call flail chest, where the ribs are broken and then you're sucking air, basically. You can't breathe. And that Alexander, the last of those 4, had enough damage to his neck that it looked deformed. So he'd broken it or something at some point, though he was listed as having died of hypothermia.
Oh, that won't kill you immediately necessarily. So
yeah, but he was pretty beat up. Something horrible happened to those 4. So again, just like the others, autopsies indicated that they died within 6 to 8 hours of their last meal. So whatever happened pretty fast between the first person dying and the last 4 dying. So whatever this was. And the coroner just called it a compelling natural force that they could not overcome. Which I don't know if that's normal coroner language or not. It just feels in English that translates as very, very vague.
Kind of argument was made in Russian as well, that's a weird way of calling it, because if it's an avalanche, just say it's an avalanche.
Right.
If it's animals, you say it's animals. But when you kind of describe it like this, it's kind of like take your guess.
Yeah, that's just super weird, because these are experienced people, and we'll talk more about the weather in a minute, but this was horrible weather. What drove them to leave the tent not 100% geared up? Why on earth would they do that? But there's no other tracks in the snow, so there were no other people there, so that the whole Mansi theory goes out the window there. And animal theories go out the window because there were, again, no tracks. Bears aren't going to hide their tracks. What would possibly do that? So now in the tent, there were, of course, personal belongings, except for that one camera that was still with Semyon, their shoes, and the other camera. And the tent itself was not burned down. So if it had been like a fire, like the stove had caught fire or something, it didn't burn the whole tent down, obviously. Nothing was mentioned about that. Now the rip in the tent, the cut in the side of the tent is mentioned, but that the tent itself is otherwise relatively intact. So that's important. So why did they get out?
That's weird, yeah.
I mean, like we said already, negative 30 to 40 degrees Celsius. That's insanity. You don't go out in that unless you're fully geared up. You don't go out in that unless you have to. And the wind was whipping, and we'll talk about these catabolic winds in just a second. So, but here's just a few odd things that I also found that I wanted to bring up because they'll feed into the theories. There's two photographs that people bring up quite a bit. You know, one of them is the one we already talked about that Semyon took, where it looks like possibly it's a picture of the night sky with a bright light, highly damaged, not certain about that one. And the other one is of a dark figure in the trees that some people try to say is a Yeti. But
looking at the picture,
that's someone in a snowsuit. Yeah.
I've seen that photo. That is not a Yeti.
No.
First of all, why does a Yeti look like a black Michelin man? That's a hiker.
So, but those are some odd things people bring up. Here's the other one that I promised earlier. Semyon was exhumed in April of 2018. His injuries, again, were compared to those of being in a car wreck. So, again, those incredibly hard pressures. So this wasn't a human or an animal attack. But what's interesting is they said that his DNA does not match any known relatives, but the facial reconstruction did match photographs of him pre-World War II. So did somebody, this Alexander, steal Semyon's identity at some point? Some people posed that as a possibility.
Do they have a possibility who this actual Alexander is?
No, nothing. I hadn't even heard the name Alexander, just that he could have been somebody else, actually.
Okay.
So, and I don't know. There's been some speculation that during the war he was working for the Nazis. He was working for the Soviets. Mm-hmm. He was a spy, and that's why
that comes into the theory. Yes.
Yeah. He did something bad, so he had to. Maybe he did something really good, but either way, he had to hide his identity.
Yes.
For what it's worth.
Yes, and this is kind of feeding that quite. But it is weird. I mean, that his DNA isn't good, but maybe his DNA was just too degraded at that point. I don't know. Now, a lot of the bodies were reported as having either orange or brown skin. Depends on the source. If you say orange or brown, and gray hair, which a lot of people say, oh, that's just because of the natural mummification and the exposure to the elements, and then other people, of course, point to that as something like the radiation. Which will come up as one of our oddities here. Other people, Mansi, other hikers, people in town, did report seeing lights in the sky in that area that night. Some of them described them as like orange glowing discs. And years later, one of the main investigators said that he had been told by high-ranking officials to ignore those reports. Now, what motivated them to tell him to ignore that, and what motivated him to talk about it at that point, I don't know. The case was quite famous at that point, so he could have just been talking out his neck. I don't know.
Right, there's always that possibility.
So, that the footprints showed that they didn't have proper shoes on or anything, but they were walking under their own power in an orderly manner, walking, not panicked. So something was bad enough to force them out of that tent, but they didn't panic and run down the hill. That seems weird.
And also on the tent was cut, and initially it was thought that it was cut from the outside, but later on, like a professional seamstress looked at the tent and said with 100% surety that the tent was cut from the inside. And these are the only cuts that were made to the tent. So they had to cut their way out.
Thank you. I'd forgotten to make that point. Yes, they cut their way out. That wasn't somebody else. Right. I'd forgotten that point. Yes, absolutely. Which is, again, why didn't they go out the front? Something happened. So now, huh? Go on.
Well, that's kind of the point, is that they had to cut themselves out. Something happened, and some of the theories that come up later, especially with the winds or the snow, it feels like that maybe they did have like some carbon monoxide poisoning, whatever fuel they were using, or something like
that's something. Yeah, I wanted to ask you, Natasha. Do you have any idea what kind of fuel they were using? I found nothing about it.
Well, by fuel, you mean like the fuel for the stove?
Yeah, it couldn't. Was it wood or
just regular wood? It was a regular wood stove.
Okay, so they just chopped wood as they went and put it in there every night.
That is correct.
Okay.
Oh, wow. That's a lot of extra work.
That's hard work. Whew.
Okay.
Okay, another oddity was that the soft tissue over a lot of these broken bones, the ones that had those kind of injuries, didn't have the kind of damage like if somebody had hit or cut or punched or something. So these were pressure injuries, not, like somebody threw a spear at them type thing. So, why did Semyon have his camera? And why would he, and it's speculated that Nikolai have been out of the tent already in that weather. Also, several of the team did have burns on their clothes and bodies. And did they come from the stove, or did they come from the fire that they built by that tree? And like I said, there's a picture from days before where they'd already had some fire damage to them. So, were they having troubles with that stove? Was this a known thing? And why did somebody put a flashlight on top of the tent with it still left on? It's like they intended to return and they wanted to be able to find it. That's
the explanation that I found, that they left the light on so that it could guide them back to the tent.
Yes, so whatever it was, they thought they were coming back, which is interesting, which kind of then rules out some of these other theories.
And this will be a good time for us to pause and come back and talk about those theories in our third section.